Hello and welcome. My name is Gerald Early, and I'm currently serve as the director of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity at Washington University in St. Louis, where I've taught since 1982. I'm pleased to welcome you to this virtual discussion hosted by the WashU Alumni Association. Joining me is alumnus author Luke Epplin, whose new book is about baseball, a subject near and dear to me. I was a consultant for Ken Burns's 1994 documentary Baseball. I'm currently a consultant for the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum for their new exhibit on Blacks in baseball. Now for today's program. I wish to explain the format. Your screen will feature me and our guest, author Luke Epplin. You are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A function. This event is being recorded and we will share it on the Alumni Association YouTube channel following this event. It is now my pleasure to introduce Luke Epplin. Luke Epplin earned his BA in English and American Literature from WashU in 2001. His latest book, the subject of our interview today, is Our Team, the epic story of four men in the World Series that changed baseball. Our Team tells the riveting story of four men, Larry Doby, Bill Veeck, Bob Feller, and Satchel Paige, whose unlikely union on the Cleveland Indians in 1948 would shape the immediate post-war era of Major League Baseball and the years beyond. Mr. Epplin's writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Slate, GQ, and The Washington Post. Born and raised in rural Illinois, he now lives in Queens. Luke will begin our program with a short reading from his book.
Thank you so much, Professor Early. This is a real honor to be speaking with Professor Early in particular. As he mentioned, I went to Washington University as an undergraduate and knew about him by reputation, read his articles when I was an undergraduate, and was always too intimidated to take classes with him. So in some way, I think this is a makeup for that youthful error of mine. All right, so my book is, as Professor Early said, is titled Our Team. It's about four individuals, one of whom is Bill Veeck. He was the youthful owner of the Cleveland Indians from 1946 to 1949. I'm going to read a short section about Bill Veeck that I hope kind of gets at what sort of individual he was. The one thing that you should know before I read this section is that Bill Veeck went to war, World War II, and was severely injured whenever a artillery piece misfired and landed on his right foot, which eventually did cause him to have to lose it. And this takes place after the off-season of 1946. The off-season came, but Bill Veeck didn't slow down. His October schedule was booked solid. He attended the 1946 World Series, jetted to Tucson for a quick visit with his family, and toured around Northern Ohio, speaking before as many groups and organizations as he could reach. Given the pain in his right foot, it was unsustainable. On October 22nd, Veeck stepped from the elevator of the Cleveland hotel where he lived and crumpled to the ground. Unable to stand, he crawled to his suite on his hands and knees. His itinerary called for him to give a talk at the Rotary Club the next day and then host a charity event in Massillon, a town about 60 miles south of Cleveland. He wouldn't think of canceling these engagements. Instead, he asked his secretary to set up a doctor's appointment upon his return. In the examination room, as soon as he glimpsed Veeck's swollen foot, the doctor sent him away to the Cleveland Clinic. There, a bedside phone line was installed. Associates briefed him daily on all Indians matters. From early in the morning until late at night, a steady stream of visitors traipsed through his room. Every corner was littered with baskets of flowers, fruit, and cigarettes. Even though Veeck, as columnist Franklin Lewis put it, had been in more hospitals than a rented wheelchair over the past few years, it was different this time. The orthopedist laid down an ultimatum: the foot would have to come off. At 10 minutes past noon on November 1st, 1946, Veeck was wheeled into an operating room where surgeons sliced off his right leg 7 inches below the knee. At 4:30 that same afternoon, a call came into the sports department of the Cleveland Press. The voice on the other end was faint and sluggish. "This is Bill Veeck. How did those picks go today at Cincy? The Indians owner, still groggy from the effects of anesthesia, asked about that morning's minor league draft. Mere hours after the amputation, Veeck was already back to work. By all accounts, Veeck took the loss of his foot in stride. When sports writer Hal Leibovitz first visited the clinic after the operation, he found a bedridden Veeck playing with a slinky. More than 1,000 letters and 300 telegrams were piled up next to him. So many bouquets of flowers had poured in that Cleveland florists had started to discourage callers from placing orders. Veeck shrugged at the attention. I said there would be changes made and players cut right and left when I bought the Indians last summer. And what happens? I'm the one who winds up getting cut. But it could have been worse. Bob Feller's right arm, for instance. I'd rather give a leg to the Indians than have anything happen to Bob's pitching arm. 17 days after the surgery, Veeck was discharged from the hospital. A truck was needed to haul away the mounds of gifts that had accumulated in his room. 2 months later, he was fitted for an artificial leg at the J.E. Hanger Company in downtown Pittsburgh. The one he chose was carved from English willow and fastened on with brown leather straps. After attaching the wooden limb, Veeck took a few uncertain strides forward. Then, according to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a cocky grin spread over Veeck's face. Soon he began strutting up and down the store corridors. Take it easy, Bill, one of the clerks pleaded. A fellow shouldn't bite off more than he can chew at first. Depends on how big his mouth is, Veeck shot back, and with a flourish, he swung his new leg high like a dancer in a chorus line. Being rid of the crutches on which he'd hobbled about for the better part of 2 years was cause for celebration. His custom-tailored wooden leg was slated to arrive in Cleveland in late January. Veeck sent out invitations to a Back on My Feet dance scheduled for the day of its arrival. On the evening of January 28th, more than 300 guests filled the glamorous Vogue ballroom in Cleveland's Holland Inn Hotel. Veeck didn't hold back. He danced waltzes and rumbas, foxtrots and sambas, whatever the Sammy Watkins orchestra threw at him. After a while, blood started to trickle down the wooden appendage that had been delivered only hours earlier, leaking onto the dance floor. If he was in pain, Veeck didn't let on until the last guest had retired. Then he limped to the elevator and collapsed upon reaching his floor. Just as he'd done 3 months earlier, he crawled on his hands and knees to his room. There, as Veeck later wrote in his autobiography, he discovered that the strain of dancing had rubbed his tender stump raw, and the blood, in drying, had glued it solidly to the wooden leg. He had to soak for hours in a hot bath before the prosthetic unstuck itself. Afterward, according to Franklin Lewis, he writhed in bed while ripping pains tore at the flesh of his stump. So that is a vivid passage that I think gets at who Bill Veeck is and what he went through to get that Cleveland Indians team, what he gave to the team that season.
Yeah, that's a remarkable passage. It was quite powerful and moving to hear. And starting out with that, I'd like to ask my first question, which is about the story of the integration of Major League Baseball.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, that story is told through Jackie Robinson, Branch Rickey, and the Brooklyn Dodgers. Well, anyone who knows this about Major League Baseball knows about that story. What led you to approach the story differently through the American League rather than the National League, and through people like Veeck, Satchel Paige, Larry Doby, Bob Feller? They seem on the surface like an unlikely quartet to tell your story, yet you do it quite effectively. What led you to that?
You know, what led me to it has to do with my time in St. Louis. I'm from a small town in rural Illinois, about maybe an hour away from St. Louis. I grew up a tremendously big Cardinals fan, but my grandfather, who is also from that area, grew up a huge fan of the St. Louis Browns. Before 1955, I guess, St. Louis used to have two Major League Baseball teams, the Cardinals, who were usually pretty good, and the Browns, who were almost uniformly terrible, minus 1944. My grandpa was an odd man in that he loved the Browns, and he used to tell me stories about the Browns when I was growing up. So I knew more about the Browns than a lot of people did who had already left decades after I was born. And some of the more interesting stories he told me were about the Browns' last owner, which happened to be Bill Veeck. He bought the team after he had sold the Cleveland Indians in 1949. And it was with the Browns that he really did some of his most notorious stunts, brought a little person to the plate, had people managed from the grandstands, gave away tremendously entertaining giveaways, all these sorts of things. And so I grew up with a sort of an idea of Bill Veeck as being a larger than life figure that would be a fascinating person to put at the center of a narrative. And so once I started writing and thinking about wanting to do a book, I came back to that idea of Bill Veeck. And I first started, my first idea that I pitched my agent was about Bill Veeck and the Browns, to sort of honor my St. Louis roots and to dig deep into that team that I knew as a child. It was really only while researching Bill Veeck and his previous stint as owner of the Indians that I came upon the story of Larry Doby. And Larry Doby is the second Black player to break into Major League Baseball in the 20th century. He was the first person in the American League, came in 11 weeks after Jackie Robinson did. And as Professor Early noted, I knew the story of Jackie Robinson pretty well, simply because it's part of our cultural imagination still. I knew Larry Doby mainly as an answer to a trivia question. If someone had asked me who the second player was, I would have been able to answer that. But if someone had said, tell me more about Larry Doby, what did he do? What was he like? What sort of player was he? What was his experiences in the major leagues? I wouldn't have been able to answer, even though I had season tickets to the Cardinals since I was a kid and considered myself to be quite a big baseball fan. So I figured that if I didn't know about the story of Larry Doby and Bill Veeck, there must be quite a few others that also didn't know of this narrative. And it was really only while sort of researching that I noticed that there were two other figures that you had in there, in Bob Feller and Satchel Paige. And I kind of saw that each one of those people represented a different facet of the integration experience. You had Veeck as a more sort of progressive white owner, Feller as a more traditionalist white player, and then Paige and Dobby represented sort of opposing ends of a generational divide in the Negro Leagues. And so I thought that if you put all four of them together and in tension with each other, you could have a story that can represent integration in full from an alternate angle than the one that is normally told. And it could be just wildly entertaining as well, because I mean, gosh, you had Veeck and Paige, two of the most fascinating people around. So it had everything that I was looking for, even though before I started writing, knew nothing about it.
Yeah, well, certainly Veeck and Paige are two of the more colorful people in baseball. How you wound up framing it, I think, turned out to be very successful, and certainly is an interesting kind of counterpoint to the typical story of Robinson, Branch, Rickey, and the Dodgers. What were some of the most important things you learned about post-World War II America in writing this book?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind has to do with baseball itself. Baseball in 1946 just absolutely exploded in both attendance and in popularity. And that happened not only in the major leagues, but it also happened in the Negro Leagues. The Negro Leagues had its most well-attended season ever in 1946. And so you see these sort of men that are coming back from serving in the war, some of them for 3 to 4 years, and they're really looking to baseball to reestablish a sense of normalcy in the United States. Baseball is something that they were listening to on shortwave radio while in the armed services, that they were talking about with other troops from different parts of the country. It really was something that they used to think about. Whenever I get back, this is how I'm going to reestablish normalcy. You even see Bob Feller when he comes back from serving in the Pacific, and they asked him in his first day back from his service, what is it that you're really looking forward to the most? And he said, well, malted milks, duck hunting, and baseball. And so attendance just goes wild in 1946. All sorts of records are shattered. And as I said, not only in the white major leagues, because Jackie Robinson did not yet come to the Brooklyn Dodgers, but also in the Negro Leagues. The Newark Eagles, where Larry Doby is playing, shatters their attendance record that season. So it's a real sort of way that the sport is offering a balm to a nation that is seeking to move beyond what was there. And then, you know, the war really sort of exposed what I guess the Pittsburgh Courier called the double V narrative of that, the victory on the home front and the victory abroad. And the victory on the home front has to do with Jim Crow and segregation and all these sorts of things. And so it really brings these issues back to the forefront. The Depression had sort of taken segregation a little bit off the table, a little bit in Major League Baseball, but then you come back and it's just kind of, it's everywhere. It really sort of spurs changes within Major League Baseball. So yeah, 46 to 48 are some of the most exciting times in Major League Baseball. It was a real rich area to explore. I mean, we didn't even talk about sort of things like unionization, baseball players fleeing to Mexico because they're unsatisfied with their wages, which was happening across industries during that time. There's just so much to dig into there. And unfortunately, my book could only do a cursory examination of some of those issues. So yeah, one of the more fascinating periods in sports, certainly.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think there was such a pent-up demand for baseball after the war? Baseball, would you consider baseball to have been the major American sport at this point, and the major American sport for both Black people and white people at this point? Would that be safe to say, fair to say?
Oh, I would certainly say so at that point. The NFL was still sort of in its infancy. Professional basketball was just getting organized at that point. Really, most of the great athletes were still being funneled into Major League Baseball. I think that Major League or Negro League Baseball, Larry Doby is an interesting case in point there. When Dobby went to high school, he was at a high school in Paterson, New Jersey. He was a 4-letter athlete in basketball, football, baseball, and track. There were a few of Doby's teammates who are still alive in their 90s that I talked to, and they all told me that baseball was Larry Doby's 3rd best sport. His best sport was basketball. They were saying he was doing moves that they wouldn't see until Elgin Baylor comes into the NBA. And his 2nd best sport, they said, was football. He led his team to a state championship in New Jersey. And so if Larry Doby were born even 20 to 30 years later, he might not have gone into baseball. But at that time, baseball was the sort of king of the hill of American sports. And it was one of the few places where an athlete could really make a living, even in the Negro Leagues. And so that's where Doby sort of channels his energies into. And so, yeah, that for athletes in particular, I think that was the case, but also for fans. I mean, World War II saw an explosion of baseball being used in the armed services. One of the first things soldiers would do when they would take over an island in the Pacific was sort of bulldoze a part of it and build a baseball field where soldiers could relax, or they could stage games and things like that. You had Major League players that were being sort of shuttled around the Pacific and Europe playing exhibition games for troops at that time. Baseball was used as a diplomatic source, as a way of sort of entertaining troops, things like this. And so by the time that these troops get back to see it live, it really sort of, it had so much sort of symbolic and patriotic meaning attached to it that that it became a way of sort of reintegrating into the society.
Yeah. The point you raised about Dobby, he has similarities to Jackie Robinson. Mm-hmm. Robinson was also a multi-sports guy. Baseball was not his best sport. And he was also a guy in college where he was used to playing with white players, just as Dobby was in high school, used to play with white players. You feel this may have factored into Veeck's interest in him, that he was used to being around white players and used to being in an integrated setting.
Oh, it absolutely did. It was one of the things that Bill Veeck in particular talked about that he wanted. He wanted a sort of person that was used to integrated settings. Larry Doby's high school had in Doby's class, he had a couple hundred people. I think that the one person I talked to said it was roughly 400 people. And out of that, there were only like 8 to 10 Black students there. So we're not talking about a very sort of evenly integrated sort of high school. Dobby on the baseball team was the only African-American player on that team. And so he was used to being in these all white spaces and navigating the tensions and the issues and things that come up with this. And that was certainly attractive to someone like Bill Veeck, who wanted somebody. I mean, Bill Veeck had this very different idea than Branch Rickey. Branch Rickey slow walked Jackie Robinson into the major leagues. Jackie Robinson gets signed in October of 1945, goes through one spring training, an entire year in the minor leagues, then another spring training. So by the time Robinson debuts in April of 1947, he's had 18 months to sort of acclimate to these all white spaces, to the abuse that he was being thrown, and just sort of the way that teammates have responded to him. Bill Veeck had this alternate idea that put too much pressure on Jackie Robinson, that it was too much to bear. And Veeck really believed that the best athletes in the Negro Leagues were as good as anybody in the majors. And so he thought that you could just throw someone like Larry Doby into the major league fire. He might sort of have a adjustment period, but then he'd get used to it. And so it was important for Veeck to have somebody who had some sort of experience with all white clubhouses. And so certainly the fact that Larry Doby went to an integrated high school factored into what Veeck was looking for.
Was there a tough adjustment for Doby going to the major leagues? Because in his first year, he was not a starting player, unlike Robinson. Did this present special challenges for him not being a starting player?
Larry Doby would say later in his life that he sort of danced around the idea, but I think he more or less intimated that he had it tougher than Jackie Robinson. Robinson, as the sort of pioneer, as someone who was in the media capital of the United States, and as a starter immediately in Major League Baseball, had a spotlight on him pretty much at all times throughout that season. So much of what was happening to him was either reported on or just sort of known that it could be reported on. Larry Doby gets thrown into the Major League fire on July 5th, 1947. And there's a sort of crush of media people within the first 2 weeks, but whenever it becomes evident that Larry Doby is not going to be playing very much and that he is struggling quite a bit, the attention dies down. And Doby sort of feels that he's suffering through as much abuse and sort of difficulties, loneliness, alienation, all of that stuff as Jackie Robinson is, but in a much more sort of under the surface way that it's not being sort of reported upon or even really acknowledged. Doby has a tough time because Lou Boudreau, who was the player manager of the Cleveland Indians during that time, really says that he's going to put Doby into the starting lineup. In Doby's second day with the Indians, he slots him into the second game of a doubleheader at first base. Playing first base for the Indians at that time was a guy named Eddie Robinson, who was 26, had been through several seasons in the minors, the war, things like that. He was really struggling to sort of hang on in Major League Baseball. Eddie Robinson, he's from Texas. He has a sort of attitude that he's against integration for sort of cultural reasons and all that sort of stuff. But he also doesn't want to lose playing time at that point, particularly to somebody that he really feels did not deserve that spot because he hadn't risen up through the minors. So when Eddie Robinson saw that he was going to be replaced by Larry Doby in that game, he not only voiced his displeasure, he quit the team. He said, I refuse to dress, I'm out of here, I'm leaving. And it really took one of the Indians' assistant coaches to come down midway through that game and tell Eddie, you don't know what you're doing. This is going to hang over you. Please just come back up. He does. He stays on the team. But after that, Lou Boudreau never starts Doby again that season. And Boudreau doesn't say that it was because of that. But the very next interview Boudreau gives in the press, he says, well, I thought I was going to play Doby more, but now maybe I need to sort of reassess. And so it's very clear that the Indians brass, which goes all the way up to Bill Veeck, did not think through these sorts of scenarios and did not have the proper preparation for not only Doby, but his teammates and telling them, you know, this, he's part of the team now, and all this sort of stuff. And so because of that, Dobby never gets a chance to really play in 1947, and instead comes off the bench, and he's never come off the bench. So he has quite a terrible year that year, and a lot of people just thought, that's it, he's going to be gone.
Mhm. So would it be safe to say you kind of agree with Larry Doby's assessment that in some ways he had it harder than Robinson because he wasn't an everyday player, because there was fear on the team that he was going to take somebody's job and wasn't qualified to take it? This is almost sounds like a little bit like affirmative action with integration, that he wasn't qualified to take it. So if he had a bad game because he wasn't an everyday player, he couldn't expect to go out there the next day and make up for it. So there's a terrific amount of pressure to perform well when you're not a starting player, because you don't know when you'll get another shot at being going out there. So do you agree with, in short, do you agree with Dobby in how he saw his situation?
Well, I'm always going to be sympathetic to Dobby because of how much time I had to spend trying to research him. But I mean, I do think that, like, so Dobby's situation, for the people that don't know, he is playing for the Newark Eagles in 1947. He finds out that the Indians are interested in him about a week before they sign him. And it really is such a whirlwind for him. He plays one last game with the Newark Eagles on July 4th, 1947, Independence Day. It's a home run. Then he quickly changes in the locker room, rushes over to the Newark train station, and then catches a train to Chicago, where the Indians are playing a series against the White Sox. He sleeps on the train that night. The very next morning, he's in Chicago, and he quickly signs and is in an Indians uniform that next day. He literally goes like 12 hours from the Newark Eagles to the Indians. And you would think that this would be a momentous occasion, but in the train station before he's about to go, there are reporters kind of surrounding him, and Dobby has his head in his hands, and he is almost catatonic. He can't process how massive of a life change this is going to be. And he talks about, he says to a reporter for the New York Amsterdam News that he feels like he's going somewhere far away and foreign. He kind of uses terminology like this, and it's really difficult to understand, or at least for me, at least to understand how heavy that must have been for him. And then he goes onto a team where he doesn't have another player that's sort of sympathetic to him. He has to go to hotels alone late at night. He says that if he strikes out in his only appearance that day, he's not allowed to sort of go out with his teammates and sort of have a couple beers, sort of get over it and stuff like that. He kind of stews in it, and just kind of, the alienation and loneliness is so great that he even says towards the end of the season that he wishes he were still in the Newark Eagles. I do think that the fact that he doesn't play, that his teammates remain so sort of icy cold to him, and that he has this sort of abrupt transition that is then just kind of abandoned, as I said, within a week, whenever Veeck and Boudreaux were like, oops, we kind of messed up here. But then he has to sort of linger on the team. It really put this tremendous strain on him. And I don't know if it was worse than Robinson, but it was certainly different. Yeah. And it was a different kind of pressure than Robinson, who was playing every day en route to winning Rookie of the Year, had. Because it was sort of just as you said, almost like an affirmative action thing. And that's what, there was an article in the sporting news around that time where a bunch of unnamed all-stars from the All-Star game were saying that, is this how it's going to be? Just these Black players are going to come in and not have to go through the minor leagues, and they're just going to get our jobs? There was this sort of sense of, I guess, what nowadays you would say reverse discrimination that people were voicing at that time. And so it did take Dobby quite a while to get over that. I would say not until really the Indians win the World Series the next year does he get over that.
I wonder if you could say a few words about Satchel Paige. Satchel Paige is 180 degrees different from Larry Doby, and certainly one of the most colorful and certainly one of the greatest players ever to play professional baseball in the United States. So I wonder if you could say a few words about this other person in your quartet.
Yeah, Satchel Paige is quite different than Larry Doby. He too comes onto the Indians without ever going into the minor league baseball. But of course, his situation is vastly different. Larry Doby is 23 whenever Bill Veeck signs him in 1947. Whenever Satchel Paige signs in 1948, he's 42. But there's this sort of, game that newspapers like to play back then about guessing Satchel Paige's age. And so some people thought he was in his 50s or even perhaps beyond. Um, he's somebody that was really such an icon at that time. He built himself up into a one-man franchise in the Negro Leagues. He had this sort of persona where he would sort of slow walk to the mound, poker faced, do these sort of wild windups and stuff like that, and throw then the fastest pitch that people had ever really seen. He would lease himself out to whatever teams needed a boost for their gates, whether they were sort of local teams, factory teams, semi-pro teams, stuff like that. And of course, he made a tremendous name for himself on what was then known as the Barnstorming Circuit. This would happen in October after the World Series, both for the major and the Negro Leagues. And it mainly consisted of players banding up together and going to sort of smaller cities throughout the United States that didn't usually get a chance to see Major League or Negro League players pitch, and playing these exhibition games that then they could make a little bit of money before they headed back to retirement. And they could do things in those games that you couldn't normally do in a Major League game. Notably, you could have teams of all white players playing against all black players. And so Satchel Paige was the one that major leaguers really kind of wanted to have to oppose, because his name alone could bring in thousands of extra fans, which of course padded the paychecks that they were going to get. And so he really sort of made a name for himself as somebody that could take on these major league squads and just defeat them with kind of ease. And so there were all these players from Dizzy Dean to Joe DiMaggio to Carl Hubble to Lou Gehrig that would just say that Satchel Paige was a phenom. And so by the time that he comes onto the Indians, he's already a legend and somebody whose name is crossed over sort of racial lines in a way that other black players that were perhaps just as good, like Josh Gibson, maybe didn't. But he was a different generation than Larry Doby. And Dobby was somebody who preached the gospel of dignity, who was somebody that really wanted to sort of, I guess, really represent the race in a way that was, he would always use the word dignified at that time. And when he looked at Satchel Paige and his sort of perpetual lateness, the way that he used humor to deflect things, all these things like this, he saw a stereotype that he was trying to counter. And so Larry Doby and Satchel Paige did not get along. So much so that in the 90s, before Larry Doby passed away, he was still saying that Satchel Paige had been bad for baseball. And so these two, even though they were roommates and really helped the Cleveland Indians win a World Series, did not get along.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The younger generation's response to someone like Satchel Paige is not unlike the younger generation of jazz musicians in their response to Louis Armstrong, and seeing Louis Armstrong as this old-time comic kind of figure, and everything, despite his brilliance as a musician. It's quite similar.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'd like to have you talk a little bit about this quote I found in the early part of your book, which I found interesting. Their unlikely union, that is Doby and Feller and Veeck and Paige, would elevate sports as a business and the individual athlete as a brand, and would help puncture longstanding stereotypes that so much of white America harbored toward Black players. I wonder if you could explain a bit what led you in your research to come to these conclusions about this period that you're talking about and these people, because what you say here is really very interesting about the effect that you feel they had a real terrific impact on the outcome, on what the game is. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's two parts to that quote there. The first that you had mentioned was the sort of individual athlete as a brand, the sort of business aspect of these sorts of things. And that was really in reference to two figures in the book. Bob Feller and Satchel Paige.
Mhm,
These are
mhm.
two of the most entrepreneurial athletes that you could ever imagine. We haven't really talked about Feller yet, even though he's one of the quartet of the people. So I'll just sort of briefly say that he had what I still think is the greatest origin story ever for an athlete. He was somebody who grew up in a very small town in Iowa on a farm. He had this tremendous ability from a very early age. So his dad, taking note of that, cleared off a part of their farmland and built him his own baseball diamond. It was essentially kind of like the original Field of Dreams, if you will.
Mhm, mhm.
And there he sort of played against men many, many years older than him and sort of started this chatter across the baseball landscape. He makes the Indians at the age of 17. And in his very first start ever, his first major league start, he ties the American League's record for strikeouts. 4 starts later, he ties the major league record for strikeouts.
Mhm.
Bob Feller is so popular that his high school graduation the very next year is broadcast live from coast to coast by NBC Radio. He's on the cover of Time magazine by the time he's 18. But that to me is not the most interesting thing about Feller. It is quite an amazing story. But he recognizes the power of that narrative and how to monetize it. And he uses the narrative as currency throughout the rest of his life. He really is at the forefront of sort of branding himself and making himself sort of his own brand. He does all of these incredible opportunities that he has. He gets a syndicated column. He has his own radio show. He does these barnstorming tours that he funds and organizes himself. And by the time he in 1946 comes around, he has made more money off of all of these things than any athlete in history, including Babe Ruth. And he becomes so sort of big that he's the first US athlete in any sport to incorporate himself. And so it's really sort of thinking of himself as this brand. As incredible as that is, Satchel Paige was, I think, even more amazing. I mean, he is somebody who is playing in, the Negro Leagues during the sort of depths of the Depression at a time whenever the league is really in financial dire straits. And he not only sort of builds himself up into this one-man franchise that can command an incredible fee and part of the gate whenever he is barnstorming, but he, by the time the sort of late 30s comes around, is making more than nearly all major league superstars are. He takes his sort of, without any of the sort of advantages that Feller has just by dint of his race, basically. I really think that what Paige did is just one of the incredible feats. I mean, on par with Michael Jordan doing a billion dollar shoe company. So I really think that that's kind of that sort of angle, the way that these two men sort of not only changed how to sort of monetize themselves, but came together in so many different ways. They recognized that entrepreneurial angle. These two individuals weren't necessarily friends. Feller said some pretty harsh things about Paige throughout the years, but they recognized that they could form a business partnership that could elevate both of them. Sure. In terms of the second part of the quote, and I'm sorry this is quite such a long answer, Larry Doby, the second part of the quote, for those that don't remember, are that it would puncture the stereotypes that so many in the white world had about Black athletes. I'm using kind of Feller as an example here. Bob Feller was somebody who used to barnstorm constantly against Black players in the offseason and often got beat by them. In fact, frequently did. But when anybody would ask him, oh, do you think that any of these players can make the majors, would invariably say no. And whenever they asked why, it wasn't because there would be problems or something like this. He would always just say, well, some are pretty fast, some can hit pretty well, but they don't have the complete package. He kind of looks at these players as deficient in many ways, or just as kind of like showmen. And I think a lot of white fans did think of these players more as performers. You saw sort of newspaper articles at the time arguing against integration as saying, well, these players don't have what it takes when the games really start, that they have all this talent, but it's more sort of formative sense. Larry Doby, in doing what he did, he completely flops his first year for reasons that we've already kind of gotten into. And a lot of people looked at Jackie Robinson as just being exceptional. And then these other players that came after him, Dan Bankhead, Willard Brown, Larry Doby, they all sort of struggle and they'd be like, well, maybe Robinson's the only one. Even Bill Veeck said something similar to that. We need another generation for this talent to get built up. But Larry Doby's subsequent turnaround in 1948 from an absolute flop to really the catalyst that drove the Indians into the World Series. There is no World Series for the Indians unless Larry Doby doesn't have this incredible turnaround. Really showed that, really sort of punctured this idea of the sort of performer and showed how much he could sort of improve and then drive that team to the next level if you give him the space and the time to make mistakes, to find himself, to do all these things on the field. And that was so much of the problem. They were not giving these Black athletes the space. If they didn't perform right away, they were usually just cut. But Veeck really stuck with him, and he's rewarded with the championship that he lost his leg to try to get, basically.
I have some guest questions here I'd like to pose to you. One is from some baseball John. What were the challenges of compressing 4 individual biographies into one book? All 4 of these people have had books written about them. And so how were you able to deal with that challenge of compressing these 4 stories into one integrated story?
Well, I guess the short answer to that question is that I did not try to write biographies of any of them. As you had mentioned, they all have biographies about them. And some of them go into, I mean, not some of them, nearly all of them are really wonderful. Larry Doby has a great one by Joseph Thomas Moore. Satchel Paige has a couple of them that I really admire. Bill Veeck had one by Paul Dixon. All of these great biographies were tremendous aids to me. I was really looking at sort of the ways in which these men intersected or had sort of experiences that rhymed. And so I was sort of looking at sort of the weaving together of these. And so I was focused so much on like making sure that the Page and Feller sections kind of coincided with each other. I was looking for ways to sort of spin a story that could weave together the narratives, not so much trying to tell a comprehensive story about their lives. There were some things that I just had to cut all together, like statistics. My book really doesn't have a lot of that. Things like this. I really focused on trying to make it as readable and as propulsive as possible, because I thought to myself that really the most important thing here is trying to reestablish the narrative of Larry Doby and Bill Veeck and all these sorts of people, because it is as exciting and meaningful as the narrative of Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey, but we've kind of lost it. And so I really just wanted to make it sort of readable and accessible.
Yes, you did succeed in that. My daughter a couple of weeks ago picked up the book and just started reading some pages of it. And she said, "Oh, this is interesting. Baseball book. It doesn't have any statistics in it. It's really interesting to read."
I know, right?
So, she's a non-fan, an absolute non-fan. So
Oh,
you have reached
oh, I love it.
a certain audience there. A total non-fan thought your book was very interesting.
Oh man, that's cool.
Another question. Why do you think baseball has fallen out of favor? This is kind of off the track, but perhaps you might have something to say to this, at least somewhat among African-American youth. This is a question that is posed. I've heard it a lot. Is there a way to reverse the trend? Have you given any thought to that at all?
I did write a book about the 1940s, and it's tough for me to generalize how something that was so meaningful and resonant to Black fans at that time and players has seemingly fallen out of fashion. I will sort of go back to this point that I made about Larry Doby, that if Larry Doby had been born decades later, I don't think he would go into baseball. And it wouldn't necessarily be because Doby didn't love baseball. He clearly did. But he was more skilled at football and basketball, and those would have been more resonant to him regardless. And you could say that about a lot of athletes, I think. Monty Irving was somebody who was also tremendous high school athlete in various sports. Bob Gibson was tremendous athlete in numerous sports. And I do wonder if some of these individuals might have chosen not to go into baseball for a variety of reasons. So that's the only thing I really had, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, why you think this might be the case.
Well, in discussing it over the years, I think it's a complicated thing. I do think that I do think the rise of professional football and basketball affected things, but that had to go along with the integration of big time college athletics, because they are the feeders for basketball, professional football. So those things had to kind of line up, and those things didn't line up until many years later. But they did offer a different track for for Black people who had tremendous skills as athletes.
Right.
I also think that the fact that baseball exists in the Black community, not simply as a sport, but as a business, as a certain kind of organizational practice, that it was believed that it was something that was going to elevate the race, and things of this nature, that the way integration occurred with baseball, and that Black people in the roles of coaches, managers, administrators did not integrate. They didn't integrate as a league, as a structure. I think also had an effect on Black people overall in their relationship with baseball, because of the relationship they had before with the sport occupying the space that it did in Black cultural life. And so I think that had an effect as well. Also, nowadays, people will tell me that the expense of playing Little League Baseball and the structure of it now and so forth works against people from poor backgrounds, and Black Americans, particularly from poor backgrounds. So those were some of the reasons that have been given about that. Of course, younger Black people today tend to be more in tune with football and basketball, and partly because those sports have so many Black people in them. So it becomes a kind of a chicken and egg sort of thing. The more Black people in the sport, the more Black people will watch the sport and be fans of the sport and so forth and so on, and want to play the sport. So and the more they want to play the sport, the more fans you get. So it's a kind of cycle. So I think that has something to do with it as well. So I think it's a combination of several of those things.
Yeah, thank you.
What's up for you next after this?
Well, I'm going to pivot away from baseball, and just as I kind of wrote about the 1948 Cleveland Indians in baseball, a team that I think is really meaningful, but perhaps maybe not as culturally resonant. I want to write about the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers in basketball. I love that team, and I want to sort of focus it on two individuals, Dr. J and Moses Malone, who I absolutely love. And Moses in particular, he won 3 MVPs, and as far as I can tell, he's the only person in any of the major sports, baseball, football, basketball, who's won that many MVPs and has never had a biography written about him.
Really, I hadn't paid attention. That's really striking to know. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? He never wrote his own autobiography, and he's never had a standalone biography. He's had a couple of YA sort of books that were written about him, but he's really kind of fallen out of the basketball consciousness. And he himself was rather press shy and a little bit gruff. He kind of reminds me of Larry Doby in some ways, but I do think that his greatness is not as sort of readily accessible in this YouTube era. What he was doing with sort of offensive rebounds and defense and all these other things is not as flashy as, say, Dr. J, who I still think is quite resonant. But so I really am interested in sort of digging into the 83 Sixers and the sort of, I think they're one of the first sort of super teams. They signed Moses Malone directly from the Rockets to take on the Lakers and the Celtics. And so that's what I'm moving toward now. How about you?
Well, first I have to say that I do hope you write that book. I'm a big fan of that particular iteration of the Sixers, and so I really would love to read that book.
Mhm.
I myself am working on a book about the history of Black conservatism and looking at Black conservatives, particularly Black conservatives today, who they are, why they think the way they think, and trying to understand the world of the Black conservative, and who feel that they're very misunderstood people. And perhaps they are very misunderstood people. I don't know. But that's why I'm working on. I find them to be very interesting, and I hope when I finish this book, other people will find them interesting to read about too.
Absolutely. That's a really resonant topic. I'm sure it's going to be wonderful.
Well, thank you so much. And, thank you so much for being here today, doing this interview, writing this marvelous book, and
Well, thank you.
which is just great. So thank you so much for conversing with us today about your book.
It was a pleasure, Dr. Early. Thank you.
And thank all of you who've been watching so much for joining us in this event today. We really appreciate it very, very much. Stay tuned for upcoming events sponsored by the WashU Alumni Association, and have a good rest of your day. Bye.